This is Duke University.
We are truly lucky to have Alan McBride here. I've wanted to bring him to Duke for a long time, and this finally worked out. Alan is one of the busiest people I know, and not in the I'm so busy way that a lot of Americans have, but he's truly engaged, hardworking, and very thoughtful. And he's someone who is both personally and professionally committed to social justice and human rights. I first met Alan in 2008 when I went to Northern Ireland to look into the possibility of starting a Duke Engage program there. It was the first time I'd actually gone there. And I wanted to see if it would be possible for Duke students to work with groups engaged in the peace process. And Alan very graciously met me and agreed to have a student start to work for his organization, which is called WAVE. I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about it. It has offices all through the province. In the big house where WAVE has its offices in Belfast, we talked for quite a while, and I think of the house where the Pevensey children find the wardrobe gateway into Narnia. It's kind of like that kind of house, except a lot dustier and with half-empty teacups all over the place. Alan was very generous and encouraging about Duke Engage. At the time, the project that we talked about was to create a memorial garden outside the building for family members who'd lost loved ones in the Troubles. As it happens, Alan got the funding and arranged for the garden well before we could even get off the plane. And that's kind of the way it is with Alan, as many a Duke Engage student has discovered. His journey to this work is rooted in a personal tragedy. His wife, Sharon, was among the people killed by the IRA in the Shankill bombing of a fish store in 1993. Also killed was Alan's father-in-law, Desmond Frizzell. The 10th person who died in that attack was the IRA bomber. As Alan himself has written, he harbored for many years a deep anger at the IRA, and particularly Jerry Adams, an IRA member and now political leader, a member of Sinn Féin, who was actually the pallbearer at the funeral of the bomber. Alan himself has written, I was 29 years old at the time. We'd been married for 7 years and had one little girl, Zoe, who was 2. That was over 20 years ago, and during that time I've gone from being extremely angry, protesting outside the offices of Sinn Féin, to working together with paramilitaries on all sides to promote peace. In a process of astonishing courage and generosity, Alan came to see that a real devotion to peace would mean that he and others who'd suffered would have to talk to those who'd wronged them. As Alan has said, that's my mission. You don't make peace with your friends. You have to make peace with your enemies. But that doesn't mean, and Alan is quick to insist, that everything that happened in the conflict was right, or that it's forgotten or forgiven. He's written powerfully about the need for victims to have a voice in peace. This is again quoting Alan. Victims and survivors from conflicts right across the globe have much in common, namely the quest for truth, justice, reparations, and an assurance that violent acts will never be repeated. Alan had this advice for young people contemplating human rights as a vocation. This is part of an interview that Sarah did. Where's Sarah? She was just here. Oh, she just stepped out. That just went live on Duke today. Remember that essentially you are working with human beings. In my experience, there can often be a disconnect between what is agreed in human rights law and how it relates to people on the ground, particularly the most marginalized. Eleanor Roosevelt famously said that for human rights to have meaning, they must have meaning in small places, like churches, factories, and schoolyards, and that if they don't have meaning there, they don't have meaning anywhere. If you're considering a career in human rights, spend time in communities, get a sense of the challenges that are faced by hard-pressed families. Find a way to get past the gatekeepers, and don't be afraid to take on the bullies, regardless of whether it be the paramilitary or the cold face of the establishment. Alan sits on the board of Healing Through Remembering, a group set up to find ways of allowing Northern Ireland to address its troubled past, and currently he's the lead commissioner on transitional justice for the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. Please join me in welcoming Alan.
So thank you for the words of invite. I've called this talk Northern Ireland an uneasy peace. And I suppose for me, that's what it is. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought to an end 30-odd years of violence. And there's a lot of people that were impacted by that violence. And I can remember that night in 1998, I was at a cinema with a friend, and I came out. It was about midnight. I turned on the radio, and there was this commotion going on up at Stormont, which is just in East Belfast. And all of our politicians were up there. The world's media was there. And various commentators kept referring to the fact that the hand of history was about to be made as Northern Ireland was going to have this peace agreement, which is going to bring us away, as I was going to say, violence that pretty much I had known almost all of my life. So coming to the movies, I thought to myself, and I spoke to my friend, that we'd better get up there and just see what was going on. It seemed like there was a lot happening, so I wanted to go up. We went up, parked the car at the gates, and walked about a mile up to the Stormont estate where all the political parties were, by this time, on the lawn, giving various speeches about what was happening. The DUP, who ironically are now the lead partner in government, at this time actually had walked away from the talks and had sort of stood outside the process, and so we're criticising everybody that was taking part in trying to move Northern Ireland forward. And I was listening to this debate in the weeks leading up to the actual night of the Good Friday Agreement, and when I got up there and people were on the lawn giving their press interviews, the DUP were giving their own press interview about how this is taking Northern Ireland backwards. This is a backward step. And I can remember Ian Paisley Jr., who's one of our politicians, the son of Ian Paisley that you might have heard of, was actually walking down towards the gate, and it's a mile from Carson's statue where I met him to the gate. So I knew I probably had him for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I thought this is my chance to go and ask him about where, what his plan B was. And I knew that if I was going to have a conversation with him, I would have to tell him who I was, because it's very difficult to refuse to talk to a man whose wife was killed in a bomb by the IRA. So that's how I introduced myself, and I had him for about 15 minutes walking down there, and I actually tried to sort of rope him in by saying, look, Ian, it's great what you're doing up here. This deal is bad for Northern Ireland, and I'm with you. What is your plan? What is your plan? And surprisingly enough, for me, he didn't have one. And I think for me in Northern Ireland, that's quite often what happened. People will quite often get up and will criticise and point a finger and condemn, but when you ask them about, well, what's your alternative? They don't have one. Because of course, there was no alternative to talking. There was no alternative to negotiations. There was no alternative to sitting in a room with the IRA, with the Loyalists, and to try to thrash out some kind of a deal which was going to make peace a reality. It wasn't that Northern Ireland didn't have peace initiatives before. They did. Way back, as far as I can remember, Sunningdale 1973, I think it was our very first attempt at power sharing. Sinn Féin weren't involved in that deal. It was made by really the SDLP, who's the other big nationalist party, and the Unionists. And there were other initiatives from that. And all of them had left the people that were engaged in the violence outside the room, outside the negotiating table. And I think for the first time, the Good Friday Agreement recognised that was a flaw, and so they brought the people who were perpetrating the violence into the room to talk with them as a means of trying to promote peace. And I think I have to say to you, it has worked, at least in part. There's no doubt about that, and I was talking to somebody today that happened to come to the talk earlier that I was given, who had been in Northern Ireland, and she was there in, I think in 2000. And then she came back again in 2009, and she noticed the change just in those 9 years from a very militaristic Northern Ireland and Belfast to one where really, the amount of soldiers on the streets and security checkpoints and all were pretty much a thing of the past. In Northern Ireland, where there wasn't the same number of people being murdered and killed, and where you could go into Belfast city centre any night of the week and have a pint and not worry about how you're going to get home. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Belfast and Northern Ireland has changed for the better, and that a lot of that has been down to the changes that were brought about by the Good Friday Agreement, but it's only half the story for me. I can remember being in Washington a few years ago. It was that St. Patrick's Week when pretty much everybody in Northern Ireland comes over here and there's nobody left at home. St. Patrick's Day is a much bigger thing in the United States than it is certainly in Belfast. And I was there with all of our politicians and various NGOs, and the Northern Ireland Bureau, who are pretty much Northern Ireland in the United States, in Washington, were having a lunch where they were encouraging various key American industrialists and business people to come as a means of trying to get them to invest in Northern Ireland, because we absolutely need inward investment. So to go along with the breakfast of potato bread and soda fars and bacon and sausages, anybody who's been in Belfast and had an Ulster fry will know what I'm talking about. They had this DVD to try and sell Northern Ireland to the Americans. And it was a very, well put together DVD. It had shown Northern Ireland in all of its glory. They had obviously filmed the day when the sun was shining, which is very unusual for Northern Ireland. They had pictures of Port Stewart Strand, which is a beautiful beach, really, really cold, but a beautiful beach. And they had these horses galloping across the strand, and they had big open fires, and people were playing ceilidh music at round open fires. And they had the Crown Bar in Belfast, with everybody there from all nationalities just sitting down having a drink. The MTV Awards, I think, were to be in Belfast that particular year, and so they had pictures of that. They had our golfers, Rory McIlroy and Graham McDowell and Darren Clark, being interviewed about how wonderful Northern Ireland was. And the Titanic Centre was just about to be built. They had images of that. And the whole DVD it was fantastic, and it made you really, really proud, the fact that this was where you were from. Jokingly, I said to my friend that I was with, when we were watching this, that it looked like an absolutely fabulous place to go on holiday. And it wasn't that I didn't recognise the place, because as I've said, I did. I totally did. And part of all of that story is the success that Northern Ireland has been since the Good Friday Agreement, because before that it wasn't actually a nice place to come and visit. We didn't have that many visitors. And all of a sudden, we have the ceasefires, the Good Friday Agreement, and then we have the Lonely Planet making us one of the top 10 must-visit places on the planet. Absolutely fantastic success story, but only half the story. About 2 or 3 weeks after I got home from Washington, I happened to be at the wake house of a young man called Mickey Kearns. Mickey Kearns took his own life at 19 in Ardoyne, a Republican ghetto just in North Belfast. And when I went to the wake house, his family had come to wave. I knew that his older brother Barney had also taken his own life just 7 years previous. And when I was talking to Mickey's mum at the wake house, she introduced me to 2 other women who all lived in the same street in Ardoyne, and they had all lost children to suicide. Northern Ireland has twice the national average of suicides amongst young men than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. And whilst I'm not blaming that on the failure of the Good Friday Agreement, because I know that suicide and self-harm is a multifaceted thing, and it's tied up with all sorts of stuff, drugs, alcohol abuse, everything. But there's something for me about lack of hope or lack of ambition or lack of young people saying that they have a stake in their community, which means they go out and they end their lives at 19 or 20 years old. And so for me, and maybe it is back to that Eleanor Roosevelt quote that Robin mentioned earlier, that I had mentioned in my interview, if human rights are going to have an impact, they have to have an impact in places like Ardoyne and Turf Lodge and Twinbrook and Polglass. These are all marginalised, disadvantaged communities in Northern Ireland. And if the peace dividend is going to be felt in society, it has to be felt equally across society. It cannot just benefit those places where the great and the good live. The working class communities, which, to be honest with you, bore the brunt of the violence anyway during the dark years of conflict, have also got to see the peace dividend coming to their communities, and they've got to see some type of benefit from living in peace. And unfortunately, in Northern Ireland, even to this day, that has not happened. I work for the Wave Trauma Centre. We're a centre that works with victims and survivors of the Troubles. And most of our referrals today are coming from both loyalist and Republican areas about people that are being intimidated today. not for things that happened 10 or 20 years ago, but for intimidation that is ongoing today, because a lot of those paramilitary organisations that were involved in the conflict, while some of them have gone into politics and community development, some of them have stayed just as they were, and they've sort of gone into other avenues of criminality. They've got involved in prostitution, in drugs racketeering, and intimidating people. And, you know, that is going on in Northern Ireland today. This is not a legacy issue. This is a current issue. I was giving a talk just about a month ago. Was asked to come in and talk to some loyalist ex-prisoners around the whole question of dealing with the past. And when I got into the room and they were all there, it was like a who's who from the Sunday papers, because the Sunday papers are full of it every week about this loyalist and that loyalist involved in criminality. And I was there to talk about the past, and I wanted to say, and I have to be honest with you, I didn't have the courage to say, but I wanted to say, you know, you guys have got me here tonight to talk about the past. I would really like to talk to you about the present. I would really like to talk to you about what's going on today. I would really like to talk to you about the fact that, you know, the troubles are over and you need to pack up and leave the stage. And you need to allow your communities to grow and develop. And because part of the reason, of course, why inward investment isn't coming into those areas in the way that it should be is the fact that those paramilitary organisations are still largely intact. And so organisations are frightened to set up in communities where they're not quite sure where their money's going to be going to. I want to tell you a wee bit about my own particular journey, and then I'm going to finish with sort of talking about what I think is the big unfinished business that needs to be resolved as we attempt to build peace in Northern Ireland. Okay, I was brought up in a loyalist housing estate in North Belfast. My father was a member of the UDA, so he himself was a paramilitary. He wasn't a bad person. The Westland, where it's located in North Belfast, is surrounded on all sides by Republican nationalist communities. We moved in there in the early 70s, and in the early 70s in Belfast, there was a lot of people being burnt out of their homes as one community moved in and another community moved out. And so when we moved into Westland, I think my father was quite afraid that this was going to happen to our community. And so he joined the UDA with a number of other men. And really what they did was they just stood on roads and stopped cars coming into the area, checked driver's licenses, almost like a police force, to find out where people were going, to make sure that the people that lived in the estate were kept safe. I can remember, I'll say back to the Sungill Agreement in the 1970s, and what brought down that very first attempt at power sharing was a big protest actually organised by the UDA, and my dad was very much part of that protest. In fact, one of my earliest political memories is actually going as a small boy with him to Stormont. He was on his full UDA paraphernalia, and I was just holding his hand on that long march up to Stormont to protest about this power sharing executive. The UDA would have stood in the street and they would have stopped people coming into the areas. They would have everything closed down during that strike. There was no electric, no gas. Everybody much lived on the street, and my father was very much involved in that. I can remember there was a guy that lived in the private houses just facing our house in the estate, a guy called Michael that I used to walk to school with every morning. And I remember coming round to him. I was about 10 years old, and I called for him to take him to school. And his mother came out and said to me, "You're not to go to school with Michael ever again. In fact, you're not to play with Michael. That's it. It's finished." And I never found out until years later why his mother took that response. And I was working actually in a wee youth club in North Belfast, and his sister came to work for us, and we happened to go out one night, and I said to her, "Do you remember all those years ago, your mum and saying to me about your Michael and I, we never He says, "Yeah, do you not know what happened?" And I said, no, I don't. And apparently what happened was his father's car was taken off him at the top of our street, and my dad was amongst a group of men that took his car. And so I suppose, you know what, yeah, I can totally understand why you would want me to play with your kid if my dad was part of that group that did this, you know. But again, for me, in terms of loss, there was a lost friendship, you know, something that you probably never talk about in the Troubles, but I obviously never was able to play with that young fella again. Some of the other memories that I would have growing up would be getting involved in riots, and there was a lot of riots down where I was. I mean, every night of the week, you know, you could have went out and you could have rioted because of where the Westland was situated. I can remember, and I was telling this story today for people there, so forgive me if you were there and have already heard this, but my Uncle Cecil, who was I mean, he was like the uncle that never married in our house, and he looked at my family as his family, my mother and her kids as his family. And he was a great pillar of the church, good Presbyterian. And sometimes, looking back, it's almost unbelievable to think that people with very forthright Christian beliefs and attitudes can also at the same time harbour some very sectarian and very dark thoughts about other people. It's almost as though you can't put those two things in the same sentence, but of course you can. And I mean, if we look at the history of racism or the history of sectarianism, we will see that quite often people that harboured thoughts like that were actually people that would have considered themselves to be Christian. And my Uncle Cecil would have been very much one of those. So he would have come up to our house and he would have been watching television. And in those days, it would have been Jerry Fitt and Bernadette Devlin, who would have been the two big nationalist politicians that would have been on. And my Uncle Cecil would have looked at the TV and then he would have said to my mother something along the lines of, "Would you look at John, old Fenian bitch?" And a Fenian, by the way, in a Protestant household is a derogatory term that would be used to describe Catholics. But my Uncle Cecil swore that he could tell this woman was a Catholic just because of the way she looked. Her eyes were too close together. She kicked with her left foot. She had a Catholic look about her. Now, in Northern Ireland, during the Troubles, when I was growing up, most people were white. We didn't really have a race problem. Most people were white. We looked similar, but we had to invent ways of telling each other apart. And in Northern Ireland, whilst you couldn't facially tell people apart, quite often names and schools would have given it away. So if you were called Teresa or Seamus or Malachi or something like that, you were very obviously an Irish Catholic. Where if your name was Billy or Sadie or John, you were most likely a Protestant. And the actual TVs studios at the times actually tapped into this. I was actually having this little thought about a few months ago. I was talking somewhere else, and this thought just came to me. We had a program when I was growing up called Romper Room. You guys probably didn't get it in the States, but it was a kids program. And what it was just playing games with children and stuff like this. But at the end of the program, every week, every day, Miss Helen, who was the producer, the presenter of Romper Room, would have got a mirror with no glass in it, and she would have looked through it. And then she would have called your name out, and we were all as children sitting around the TV thinking, "Oh, Mummy, she can see me, she can see me," But I have to say to you, never in my lifetime listening to Romper Room did I ever hear her say that she saw Seamus or Teresa or Malachi. She only ever seen Mark and John and Peter and Alan. So you could sort of from that take that, are the BBC part of this big conspiracy whereby they're trying to deny Irish Catholics or Irish citizens part of their culture, and that they won't even recognise some of their names? You can sort of see how in a community where it's very segregated and people live pretty much amongst their own kind, how these rumours can start to circulate, and all of a sudden they become so big and the myth becomes so huge that you start to use them as ways to actually say, you know what, you're not like us. And if you're not like us, well, then that means that we can go and we can throw stones at you, or we can burn you out of your home. When I was growing up, I used to hear stories like all Catholics have big families, and they all have ginger hair. For a Protestant family, we were a big family, and 3 of my siblings had ginger hair. But did I ever stop at the time and say, hold on a minute, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. What do you mean all Catholics have big families? There's 6 of us. And what do you mean they've all got ginger hair? We've got ginger, 3 of you have got ginger hair. Do you know? Mum, are you trying to tell us something? Do you know? It's a sort of nonsense that you're told. And whilst we laugh about it, and of course we can as adults, and we do laugh at it, and I look back quite often and I laugh at it, but the serious and the sad aspect of it was that it was really a way that we were telling us apart from them. And of course we could never play with them or befriend them or hang out with them. We could never really associate with them, whoever them were. Them lived probably 10 minutes walk up the road, quite literally. And yet it might as well have been 5,000 miles away, because in Belfast at that time, the two communities never really got together. You didn't have any Catholic friends. You wouldn't have brought Catholics home with you. You know, Catholics never came into my neighbourhood. I never went into theirs. We never went to the same leisure centres, never attended the same schools, went to the same churches. Our parents never drank in the same bars. We lived 10 minutes apart, but it might as well have been, 5,000 miles apart because the two communities never really met. And I think for me, that's part of the Northern Irish story. It's part of the tragedy of Northern Ireland. And whilst I'm not saying for a moment that sectarianism and segregation were the cause of the Troubles, I absolutely think that they played a contributory part and certainly kept them going for much longer than they needed to go. And that if we're serious about building peace, we have to address this question of the us and them. I was quite fortunate when I was about 15 years old. I got involved with the church, the Boys Brigade, and I left that life of getting involved in riots behind me. Actually went and I worked in a little cross-community youth club in a Republican part of town. And so I got to know some people that were supporters of the IRA, got to know them quite well. And my life, I suppose, was to change forever on the 23rd of October, 1993. It was a Saturday, beautiful day. Day like today, actually, that's why I can't understand you guys talking about the weather. I think the weather is fantastic. Can't believe it, it's great. I'm going to tell everybody about it. Amazing weather we had in Durham. It was the day a bit like today. And my wife was working in her father's fish shop business that day. I was going to go out on my bike and take my daughter with me. So I got the bike onto the back of the car and got Zoe sorted out. And Sharon asked me if I'd drop her off at her father's fish shop business on the way to my bike ride. So I said I would. I dropped her off, took the car out, went along the Lagan towpath, which just goes out of Belfast for a few miles, and came back into the house. And a friend called around to say that he'd heard in the news there was a bomb on the Shankill. And he wanted, and the Shankill, by the way, is a Protestant loyalist part of town, and Sharon worked there once a month in her father's fish shop business. So I said, yeah, we'll go down and we'll see, just really to pacify him than for myself. I think part of the sadness of growing up in Northern Ireland throughout the Troubles is that you just become used to the fact that there's bombings and shootings and killings, and you don't really do anything about it. It just becomes part of your normality. I think it's quite sad today that with the latest sort of war on terror and what's going on with the rise in Islamic terrorism, I think again the world is just becoming used to the fact that this is just what happens. And I think when people do that and you get used to the fact that these things exist in society, you don't do as much as perhaps you should do to try and bring it to an end. And this was part of the Belfast that I grew up in. None of us did enough to bring these things to an end. We just accepted that this is what happened. So I went down on the Shankill Road. When I parked the car, we walked down the street. I knew that where the bomb had gone had come pretty close because the shop just was obliterated. There was just nothing there, and there was people just piling through rubble looking for bodies. Sharon was killed that day. Her dad was killed, and 8 other people, including the guy that planted the bomb. I was working as a butcher at the time in the next block down. I pretty much worked there from I left school. Didn't particularly like it, but I had no qualifications, and I thought that it was a job and paid the bills, so I did it. I could never go back to work after that because it was just so close to the bomb. I actually applied for a job and I finally got a start in the YMCA working with young people. For the first year after the bomb, I don't know how I got through it. I was absolutely just burning with anger. I got involved with an organisation called Families Against Intimidation and Terror, who were, I suppose it was my first outing into the sort of whole world of human rights. They were a human rights organisation that very much targeted paramilitaries for their abuses of human rights, and I got involved with them. This was 1994, so the first IRA ceasefire had happened, the Loyalist ceasefire had happened, and Northern Ireland was starting to come out of the dark days of trouble. But for me, I was still burning with anger because Gerry Adams, who was a very senior Republican, the leader of Sinn Féin, had actually carried the coffin of the dead bomber, and by doing so had actually shown a very public show of solidarity with that organisation. So I, if you like, through Families Against Intimidation and Terror, had a very public campaign aimed against him personally. I would have taken placards and stood outside Sinn Féin offices whenever he was there. If he was speaking at various events, I would have went out and I would have stood outside with my placard. I remember actually on one occasion, going out to Boston. In fact, the very first time I was in the United States, I went out to Boston and to New York and to Washington, where Sinn Féin were organising fundraising events. And I was there with 2 or 3 people from Belfast, and we had posters and placards trying to educate a largely ignorant American public that, while Sinn Féin are talking about peace, the reality is back home that they've been involved in these kind of atrocities. And back in those days, the IRA were still shooting children and young people in the knees for antisocial behaviour. I don't regret, I have to say to you, any of the campaigning work that I did back then in terms of how I did it. It was pretty much where I was at that time, and I think it certainly served a purpose for me. I also can remember that I started to write to Gerry Adams letters, and the thinking behind that was that, when you think about people in conflicts and how often figures just seem to roll off the tongue, 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, almost 1 million people killed in Rwanda. How many people was it that died when the Twin Towers came down in 9/11? And nearly 4,000 people died in the Northern Irish Troubles. But if you just happened to have known one of those people, if it was your brother, your son, your sister, your father, your mother, your wife, it's not just as easy to just forget that person just as a number or as a statistic. So I wanted to connect Gerry Adams with who my wife was. I didn't want her just to be a number, and so I would have written to him on different occasions. Her birthday, the anniversary of her death, at Christmas, and I would have told him little stories about her, who she was as a wife, as a mother, as a best friend. I would have sent him photographs of her as well. I remember I've written to him more recently a very different style of letter, but back then these were, I suppose, really just letters of a man that was brokenhearted because he'd lost his best friend and soulmate, and I wanted him to know that. So the penultimate letter that I wrote to him, I thought I would get smart, and I would write in Irish. Now, when I was growing up, I didn't know any Irish, don't speak a word of Irish. In fact, I wasn't actually renowned for having an awful lot of intelligence. I'm super bright now, I have to say to you, but back then I wasn't particularly smart, and my nickname was Bungalow, because there was nothing upstairs, So it's very kids can be very cruel. They can be very cruel, But anyway, in my limited intelligence, I thought I'll go down and I'll write this letter in English that I want to write to him, and then I'll go and get a dictionary and I'll just translate it. And it became apparent quite quickly, actually, that there's not a corresponding Irish word for every English word, which can be a real problem when you're trying to write a letter to Gerry Adams. So I wrote this letter in part English and part Irish, and I sent it off to him. And whatever happened, it must have did the trick. Maybe he saw the humour in it, the fact that I tried to write this letter in Irish. Whatever happened, he wrote back to me anyway. And he addressed the letter in Irish, and he concluded it in Irish, but the middle part he put in English because that's the bit that he wanted me to hear. And this was probably 2 or 3 years after campaigning against Gerry Adams, standing outside his offices, writing letters to him, confronting him in New York, Washington, and Boston, and all of that. And his response to me was to say, Alan, we in Sinn Féin understand your hurt and your pain. But you have to understand that there's nobody working harder for peace and reconciliation than Sinn Féin. And that letter arrived with me about a month after the IRA had murdered a guy in Lurgan, a little town in County Armagh, by the name of Fred Anthony. And the IRA left a bomb under Fred Anthony's car because he happened to be a cleaner, a janitor, you guys would call it, in a police station, RUC station. And the morning that Fred got into his car to drive to work, he was dropping his daughter Emma off at school. And she was the same age as my daughter Zoe. And she was very badly, her father was killed, and she was very badly brain damaged in the bomb. I still see little Emma, actually seen her just a few weeks ago. And at that particular time, when that letter came to me from Gerry Adams, I was just reading the story about little Emma, and I could see her face looking up at me from the front page of the newspaper with all the tubes coming out of it. And she was the same age as my daughter. And I had to look at that kid's face and look at this letter and these words from Gerry Adams, but you have to understand there's nobody working harder for peace and reconciliation than Sinn Féin. And I had to say to myself, how in the name of God could you be claiming to work for peace and reconciliation when an organisation that you're linked to are carrying out these kind of atrocities, not against members of the British security forces as if that was okay. It's not, in my view. But even if that was their rationale, this guy happened to be a soft target. He was a cleaner in an RUC station, and that was his crime, and that's why he was killed. So the words of Gerry Adams for me and that sort of half-hearted acknowledgement didn't really hit the mark at all. I want to park that story for a moment and move into sort of just the concluding part of my story, and then I'll come back to looking at some unfinished business. Another thing that I would have done, I suppose, to help myself come to terms with the bomb was I used to go up to my wife's grave and used to write letters. Thousands of letters, actually, probably 3 big volumes of letters. And in the early days, they were just about a man missing his wife. I was 29, relatively young. I missed her. As time moved on, I started to reflect on who she was and why she was killed. And I suppose the reason these days, when I'm giving my story, that I would quite often contextualise it by saying what it was like growing up in Belfast. Because I started to think about that. I started to think about the fact that, that I didn't know very many Catholics when I was growing up. I started to think about my Uncle Cecil. I started to think about, how we were segregated, how we discriminated, how we misjudged people simply because of where they were from. And I started to think that perhaps the person or the people, 2 people that murdered my wife, perhaps their experience wasn't that dissimilar from my own. I was fortunate, as I say, when I was 15, I got involved with the church, the Boys Brigade, but I know of other people that hung out with in those days that didn't, and some of them joined paramilitary organisations, some of them were killed, some of them were imprisoned, and perhaps, just perhaps, these 2 young people that murdered my wife were a bit like that. If they had have grown up elsewhere in the UK, if they had have been introduced to a different set of circumstances, would they have gone out and committed that murder? I mean, it's impossible to know in real terms, but at least it's plausible that they might not have done. That really what they were responding to was a set of circumstances that existed at the time when they were doing what they thought they had to do. My own father joined UDA because he wanted to protect his community. My father, to the best of my knowledge, never went out and killed anybody, but he did what he had to do. He joined an organisation because he thought that was the choice that he had, and he was exercising that choice. So if we're serious about building peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, for me, it was probably too convenient to simply say, well, if all those terrorists would just take themselves off and leave us all alone, wouldn't this be a great wee place? And to be honest with you, if I had £1 for every time somebody said that to me, I'd be a very rich man. My mother quite often came out with that sort of nonsense. This would be a great wee place if the terrorists would just go away and leave us all alone. At the end of the day, there was a context that gave rise to terrorism. I'm not justifying this by any stretch of the imagination, and please come back at me with the questions and answers if you want. I'm not justifying it because in my view there was no justification for any of it. But it helped me to understand that there was a particular set of circumstances that if we didn't address those, the troubles would just continue in another guise. And so for me, at that moment, I started to think, maybe what I'm doing in terms of going out and protesting and standing on street corners and shouting at Jerry Adams from across the street and challenging him when he was on the radio, maybe I'd be better served actually getting into a room and sitting around and having a conversation. It's one thing to think like that when you're kind of writing in the relative comfort and safety of Carmoney Cemetery. It's quite something else when you come face to face with the reality that what I'm thinking might at least be true. And I was, not long after this, actually invited to go to Edinburgh to speak to some psychiatrists who were looking at the whole issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they wanted to see how prevalent it was in Northern Ireland. So they had people there from all over the world, and then there was a little Northern Irish case study. And I was asked to come along, and there was several other people, 2 of which were ex-prisoners, and one of which I actually ended up sitting beside on the way out to Edinburgh, a loyalist ex-prisoner. And we struck up a conversation, and when the plane touched down, he said to me, Alan, I've really enjoyed talking to you. After the conference, do you think we could go out and maybe get a drink in Edinburgh and just continue to talk? And I was very aware that he was a loyalist paramilitary, and I was from a loyalist community. And I'd always gone to great lengths to try and, stand against paramilitarism, no matter from what side of the fence it was. And so to go drinking with this loyalist guy, I thought, well, could I do that? Because I was aware that there was an IRA guy there that day as well who I hadn't been introduced to. And that if I go drinking with the loyalists to the Republicans, it's going to look as if it's okay, Alan can drink with loyalists, will he not talk to Republicans? So either we didn't do this at all, or we invite this Republican guy to come with us, and we'll all go. Now this was way back before, power sharing had kicked off and devolution had taken place. This was back, it was after the Good Friday Agreement, but the people were still enemies, they still weren't talking, there was a lot of that transitional period. So it was a real risk, just the 3 of us, 2 former enemies, former combatants, and me going into a pub in Edinburgh and with alcohol. And you know how sometimes when people drink, They get violent. Sometimes people fall asleep. I fall asleep, I have to say to you, but some people get, it's always the wee quiet ones, isn't it? A few drinks there, all of a sudden Rambo. And I was, so anyway, we were having this conversation and the IRA guy came over and introduced himself. And the three of us ended up going into Edinburgh that night. And we talked about everything, the football, the weather, the conference. And then we started to talk about, what we were really always going to talk about anyway, which was ourselves. And I was talking about the Shankill bomb and what had happened to me. And at the end of it, the IRA guy touched me on the hand. And the touch was significant because it really felt that this guy wanted to say something. And he looked into my face and he says, Alan, what happened that day on the Shankill Road was wrong. And I, as an Irish Republican, I'm sorry. And for me, in that moment in time, because he didn't go on to say in the way that Jerry Adams had all the years previous, but you have to understand. Because at the end of the day, I didn't have to understand anything. My wife was killed. She was murdered by the IRA. And somebody needed to stand up and say, you know what, that was wrong. What happened to your wife was wrong, and we're sorry. Because when he did that, he moved me to an entirely new place in my journey, where for the first time I was able to listen to his story, to really listen to his story. I mean, I'd heard similar stories before, but I mean really listen, where it really went in. And so I asked him, and he says, but why did you get involved in the IRA? And he told me how when he was growing up, he had seen friends killed by the British Army. He had seen his house wrecked on numerous occasions. He'd seen relatives interned, carried off, and put into prison without trial. And he knew that when he came of age, he had to do something about this because, it was his community and he wanted to seek revenge. The Loyalist guy had an equally compelling story about why he got involved and the things he got involved in. And for me, it reinforced this notion that I had at Carmoney all those months previous, that really, if we're serious about building peace in this society, we have to start addressing the causes of the conflict and the causes of division, and that it's too convenient. Whilst they played their part, and I totally understand that, but it's too convenient simply to lay all the blame on those that picked up a gun or planted a bomb. There was a situation and a context, but I couldn't have heard that. I could not have heard that if he hadn't have first heard my story and given me the acknowledgement. And so when I'm working these days and I'm thinking about, what do we need to do in this society to address the legacy of the conflict? And I think one of the things that we have to do is to acknowledge first and foremost that there was a conflict, and that conflict produced victims and survivors on all sides. And people perhaps just need to stand up and to say that, because part of the discourse in Northern Ireland at the minute is and I have never been part of it, I have to say to you, and I've stood against it, and sometimes to my own detriment. There is a hierarchy of victims that exists, and rightly so, in my view. A hierarchy between those who were innocent and those who were less innocent. A hierarchy of those who were right and those who were wrong. And it doesn't do me any favours, or it doesn't do the process any favours when we stand up and we try to pretend that somehow we were all caught up in the same kind of conflict and we were all equally guilty and we were all equally victims, because it's just not true. For example, the guy that murdered my wife, Thomas Begley and Sean Kelly, to suggest that these two young people that murdered my wife are in the same way a victim as I am, is an insult to my wife's memory, because they went out and they took her life. And quite often people would say to you, your wife was in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, she wasn't. No, she wasn't. My wife was in the right place at the right time. She was in her place of work on a Saturday where she should be, and the people that murdered her, on the other hand, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But does that mean that I don't recognise that the Begley family or the Kelly family have needs that need to be met? Of course not. Let's park the question of the definition of a victim, which has plagued the process in Northern Ireland for years in terms of dealing with the past. Let's park it if we can't agree it, okay? Certainly don't get into this thing that we were all victims in the same way. And let's instead look at what's left behind, the needs of the people that were left behind, because I do recognise that Mrs. Begley lost a son in the conflict and that she needs whatever help society can give her to help her to move on from that tragedy in her own life. I'm sure no mother brought a son up to go out and carry out that kind of atrocity. But I don't think we get there by pretending that somehow her son and my wife were on the same page in terms of their guilt or their innocence. I don't think that's the case for me. So one of the lessons for me going forward would be this sense of acknowledgement. Let's acknowledge the hurt and the pain that was caused to everyone, and then park it and move on instead to providing for the needs of those that have been left behind. I'm almost finished, and I'm going to take some questions from the floor. But I do want to finish this with a few thoughts. You know, the Good Friday Agreement, there's a line in it that actually says that a just and peaceful society would be a fitting memorial to the victims of the Troubles. And I think that was absolutely spot on, whoever put that line in the Good Friday Agreement, because a just and peaceful society indeed would be a fitting memorial to the victims of the Troubles. But the society that we have in Northern Ireland at the moment is not peaceful, and arguably it's not just either. The investigations that are ongoing at the moment will quite often go after the foot soldiers, people who are much lower down the chain of command in terms of carrying out atrocities. But when it comes to some of the big players, I'm not suggesting for a moment that these people aren't questioned, quite often they are, but very seldom does anything ever stick. Very seldom are any charges ever brought, and so it's always the foot soldiers that end up carrying the can. I don't think that's just. I don't think that we have moved yet to the kind of shared society that was envisaged by the people that actually signed up to the Belfast Agreement or the Good Friday Agreement. Our society is deeply divided at this current moment in time. In fact, so much so that, you know, when Northern Ireland is being heralded around the world as an example of a peace process, and, you know, the Good Friday Agreement as an example of a good peace agreement, I sometimes think that it's a bit false, because living in Northern Ireland, and perhaps history will judge us kindly by saying that it's just a transitional phase that we're in, but I know that we haven't got the peace that many of us signed up to. Paramilitary still run communities in our society. Investment has not come into those areas that need it most, the likes of Ardoyne, Shankill, and some of the marginalised communities. And those things, I think, need to be addressed if we're ever seriously going to see the peace process work. We haven't really come to terms with our past. We've had numerous attempts at it. We had Megan O'Sullivan and Richard Haas just not this Christmas but past Christmas over in Northern Ireland for 3 months, working with the parties, and actually got them to within an inch of getting something agreed, and it fell apart at the last minute. The parties themselves had another go at it this year, and this year they have got something over the line, and yet we're all awaiting to see that the detail is, and sometimes these agreements fall apart whenever the detail actually is applied. It's easy sometimes to get heads of agreement around different issues, but when you actually start to drill down into the detail, sometimes they can fall apart. Dealing with the past has escaped our politicians for years, and yet it still is a huge issue that needs to be addressed. And I suppose for me, and I'll finish with this one, my other, I suppose, big quest in life is to really dealing with the past, to have a system in place that can bring redress for families. And the other one is around the Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. One wasn't included in the Good Friday Agreement, and the latter, the Bill of Rights, was. But I have to say to you, in terms of, you know, if you've set yourself up, and these are two goals that you've set for your life, I'm not hitting either of them at the moment, because they're both failing for the same reason, and that is, in my view, the lack of political will. So it's okay for our politicians to go out and to give this image that they're working together, but in real terms, the question has to be asked in terms of the substantive issues, are they actually? Because they haven't agreed a process on the past. And with regards to the Bill of Rights, the information, the advice on the Bill of Rights has been with the government for years, and yet it's just sitting, gathering dust on a shelf. And I don't need to talk to an American audience about the importance of a Bill of Rights being at the very centre, at the very heart of your democracy in terms of how you build it. And certainly whenever I voted yes in the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998, it was very much that's what I was voting for. I was voting for a new and a shared society that had rights right at its very core. And it wasn't for me, by the way, that I felt that Northern Ireland needed all these extra rights, because in real terms we actually have them anyway. My other job that I do is I sit on the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and I was just telling Robin earlier that there's a disconnect for me between the law with regards to right, which is very complex, and it's like people have written books and books and books and books and books and hundreds of books on rights, and yet there's a disconnect between that and how the people understand what their rights are. And I often, and it's probably too simplistic, but that's okay. I've got a relatively simple mind. For me, there really is only one human right, and it's Article 1 from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all people are created equal in dignity and rights, that they are endowed with reason and conscience, and that they should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, or indeed sisterhood, if it was written today. And if people were totally to live out that one human right, where equality really was something that was your lived experience, I think it would absolutely transform society. I can remember, and I will finish with this, when I was at university, my lecturer used to say to me, when we were doing values education, he says, Alan, there's only two values that should be universally applied everywhere. And they are, number one, that I am of worth, and number two, that you are of worth also. Thank you.
That you actually met with Gerry Adams.
Yes.
Face-to-face. Can you tell us about that meeting and whether it was cathartic or what you'd hoped? Of course, it was very therapeutic for me. Obviously, I had a long campaign, very, directly aimed against Gerry Adams, and so for a number of years, I couldn't have even thought about meeting him. But I suppose after I'd had this kind of transformation phase in my life, where I started to think about the conflict, about the people that got involved in it, about the fact that the role that sectarianism and segregation played, and all of that. And for me, if I was going to be true to myself in terms of the things that I was saying publicly, then a very physical demonstration of that would have been to actually meet the man who, for years, I had not necessarily blamed for the Shankill bomb, but certainly he was the person that was the public face of that organisation. So I was, in my own head, mentally preparing myself for the fact that maybe I'm going to have to meet him anyway. And then just by chance, Channel 4 did this programme where they were looking at, believe it or not, it seems like a really crazy notion, but they were doing it. They were looking at Jesus Christ through the eyes of well-known politicians. And there was English politicians involved in that, and Gerry Adams was one of them. And the programme that Gerry Adams was involved in was Jesus the revolutionary, and Gerry Adams the revolutionary, and looking at how they carried out their revolutions, and to see how you could contrast and compare. And so I was curious about what they were going to do and what Gerry Adams was going to say about Jesus Christ. I have to say too, apart from the very obvious facial hair, I didn't know of any other thing that they would have in common together. So I agreed to do the programme, and they were going to set the meeting up. But I phoned a friend of ours, and a guy that actually I would have known through Healing Through Remembering, a guy called Harold Good. Harold Good was a Methodist minister, but he also was the Protestant clergyman that actually oversaw the IRA decommissioning. So I phoned Harold up, and I knew that he had contacts in the IRA, and asked him if he could set up a meeting between me and Gerry Adams, and he did, in his house. I told the programme, Channel 4, that I was going to meet Gerry Adams. Of course, they didn't want me to do this at all, because they wanted to have the first meeting between myself and Gerry Adams to be on camera, where they could kind of film the whole, of what was going on. But my interest in meeting Gerry Adams, I have to say to you, was not about making a television programme. It was about my own particular journey. So I said to them, well, look, take it or leave it. That's the basis on which I do the programme. So they said, right, okay, there's no choice. And I met Gerry Adams in Harold Good's house. And I have to say, I was very nervous when he came into the room. He came in, we met for about 2 hours. And I was very, very nervous when he came into the room. But the first thing he said to me was, he apologised for the Shankill bomb. And this time he didn't go on to say, but you have to understand. And we had a conversation for about 2 hours about the conflict. We had a very different interpretation of that. You would not, that shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. I have always believed that the conflict was hugely inevitable. I think that if the civil rights movement at the time had have been allowed to gathered pace, if we had of some way of gotten through Bloody Sunday and there wasn't the whole fallout that happened after that, that might have been a very different end to the story. But that wasn't the way it turned out. Gerry Adams did concede that the conflict went on much longer than it had to, and that he thought by 1981, interestingly enough, so really pretty much 13 years before it ended, he thought that it had run its course anyway. And that's when Sinn Féin then started to go into the political road, but at the same time they had to keep the IRA on board, and it became the conflict transformation. So it was a very interesting meeting, a very good meeting. I was very nervous about it. There's a slight fallout because of it. The next week I was launching a book up in the Long Gallery in Stormont, where our government sits, and I'd invited all the political parties, including Sinn Féin, and Gerry Adams wasn't to be there, he was to be away. But he changed his plans and he did actually come to the book launch. But my mother-in-law, who was quite sick at the time, and this programme that I was making about Gerry Adams wasn't to go out until after Christmas, because I met before Christmas in Harold Good's house, and some journalist got wind of it, and it broke on the radio that I had met Gerry Adams, so I had to go on and defend myself. I didn't get telling my mother-in-law because I was going to tell her over Christmas because she wasn't well. This is Sharon's mum, and she was absolutely just horrified that I would even consider meeting Gerry Adams, so she fell out with me pretty big time over it. And I have to say, in all the experience that I've been through, that falling out with Elsie was probably one of the things that hurt me the most, because she's an amazing, amazing woman who lost her daughter, who absolutely just would never understand why I'd want to meet the man who was in charge of the organisation that killed her daughter. So that was a falling out. And then when the book launch came in Stormont, and I didn't know Gerry Adams was coming to it until he actually turned up, and my mother-in-law was in the same room, and I had to get word to Harold Good to tell Gerry Adams not to come over to talk to me because I'm in a lot of trouble with my mother-in-law. And to be fair to him, he just turned and left. And I emailed him later on to say, look, thanks for that. And we've been in touch since. You know, it's I don't know that my mother-in-law or other members of my family will ever come around to that. And I think that's part of the cost of building peace. You know, it is so fraught with, and if you put your head above the parapet, you know, you can sometimes, it's a very lonely road. And I know for me, coming from my community, I mean, when I was doing my whole anti-Gerry Adams thing, I was getting asked to go to speak to all sorts of unionist gatherings. Since I started to say that, you know, it's far better to sit around the table and talk to your enemy than to stand outside and throw stones or hurl insults. I seldom get invited these days to talk to unionist folk. In fact, I'm more often than not invited to nationalist events to talk to people. So there's a price to be paid for that, you know. But I do believe that some people have sometimes to stand up and start to change the script a wee bit, because if they don't, then we just go on repeating the same old stuff, you know.
The conflict in Ireland before Good Friday Agreement looked to be intractable. It had been going on and on and on, and there was no hope. But now when I look at Israel and Palestine, I see the same situation. I just cannot conceive of a solution there. Are people from that area, do they ever come to Northern Ireland to say, guys, can you give us any inspiration, any light?
You're obviously from Ireland yourself, sir.
A little bit further south.
Okay. I suppose the only encouragement that I could give the Palestinian and Israeli question is that the Northern Irish question was intractable too at one time, you know, and yet it's not any longer. Whilst it's not over and there's still things that we need to resolve, at the end of the day, the most important thing was that we got people into the room to talk. And so what I would say, in spite of what happens, and I know sometimes these things have to happen away from camera, and you know, people will say things and they'll do something maybe else, but you always have to keep the lines of communication open. I think once they die, but then that's it. I can remember, you know, whenever my wife was killed, 1994, the background of the political process at the time was the Hume-Adams dialogue. John Hume and Gerry Adams had started just a year previous to that, and then the British government got involved in that, and so there was talks going on behind the scenes way before the IRA ceasefire. And the easy thing would have been to have done whenever the Shankill bomb went off was for the British government, as they said they publicly. In fact, John Major actually is on record as saying it would turn his stomach to have any conversations with a member of the IRA, and yet at the same time he was talking to Gerry Adams. Now, I know a lot of victims would say, well, you know, I felt badly let down by John Major, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, for doing that. I have to say to you, I don't. I think those talks were probably more important when the Shankill bomb went off than ever they were. Now, there's a fine line between that and allowing, and I know this is the criticism, a paramilitary or a group of terrorists to bomb themselves to the negotiating table. I think that we have to be very careful that that's not the case. But I do know that, in my view, that militarily, whilst it might solve the problem for a short period of time and you make rid of something, the legacy that you leave in its wake can last for generations. So I think it's always better to bring people around the negotiating table, and that's about diplomacy. It's about politics. It's all of that, and these things are far better done under the radar of publicity. I think once the media get involved, it kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. So I have no doubt that even now, Israel and Palestine are probably talking, behind the scenes, and hopefully, there'll be somebody somewhere, Nelson Mandela or somebody that'll rise up and will be able to solve. But I think it's tragic what's happening out there at the moment, in the whole Middle East.
On one level, young people saying they're, teens and 20s, maybe they don't care so much about the past, but in other ways they're profoundly shaped by the past. And I'm just wondering in terms of what, because one might assume that, this is just a generational shift. And then eventually the sectarianness and all that kind of stuff is just going to go away. But in fact, that's not happening. And I wonder just what you think is sort of, again, you were talking about Northern Ireland, seeing the promotional videos. It looks like such a great place to go now, and it's cool and it's wonderful. Yet there is this inheritance of tragedy, and I just wonder if you could speak about that. I mean, what do you talk about with Zoe about that kind of stuff?
There was a while, when she was going out, and I'm not, by the way, making any derogatory point here, but she went out with a young fella for a while who was from a very hardline loyalist community. And she was happy with him. I was happy for her. There was no, in my view anyway. But she did go along to a couple of the 11th of July, where they burned bonfires and stuff like this in Northern Ireland. And so I wouldn't have been at those things for years. She was a very small girl. She was going along. I wasn't going to stop her going along, but I did say to her that, whenever they're singing the songs, just look at their eyes and look at the manner in which they sing the songs. And of course, she said, "Daddy, those men that were singing those songs, you could almost feel the hatred in their voices." And I don't know how we change that, if I'm being totally honest with you, but we have to keep chipping away at it. But there's a legacy. There's a legacy there, all right, and it's a legacy that we have to change. But it's gonna be a very slow thing. I think I was saying today at the meeting earlier that the conflict in Northern Ireland wasn't, of course, just from 1969. I mean, it was centuries old, really. And I think the peace process could effectively take that long, almost, to come out the other side. But it does have to begin by people making different choices. So it's a top-down and a bottom-up approach. I think our politicians absolutely have to take a lead in doing that, and sometimes they're not always very good at that. We had a big storm that broke just before Christmas around a very senior DUP politician poking fun at the Irish language, and Gerry Adams, the leader of Sinn Féin, referring to the Unionists as bastards in a speech which he made in the south of Ireland. And these are your two political parties that are lecturing the rest of us around the need to build a united community. And when you have these political parties, if they're not following by example or acting by example, then I think that's part of where it has to go. I remember actually, I'm just filled with little stories, so forgive me if it's boring the Arceus. But I can remember I was asked to come and talk at an event in England one time. It was a Christian Greenbelt, Glastonbury sort of thing, and they were looking at Northern Ireland and the Troubles. And I was asked to go out along with two of our politicians who were in the Assembly, but the Assembly had collapsed over the whole decommission issue at the time, so they weren't actually talking to one another. And I was writing a wee column for a local newspaper. And when I got there the night before, and in the day of the conference, the two politicians arrived, and the festival people sent them one taxi to bring the two of them in from the airport, which was an hour and a half. These two politicians that hadn't spoken to each other in don't know how long were stuck in this one taxi for an hour and a half. And obviously you can't, I mean, it's almost impossible, to sit in a car and not speak for an hour and a half when there's another human being in the car. So they obviously had struck up a conversation, and when we got to the campsite, the unionist guy looked at me and says, "Well, you're Alan McBride, you write for the Sunday Life, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He says, "Are you going to write about this?" And I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to write about yet. He says, well, if you're going to write about this, he says, I'm going to be very guarded what I'm going to say because, you can make trouble for me back home, because I'm not supposed to be speaking to him. And I says, well, look, I've no idea what I'm going to write about, but if it makes you feel any easier, I'll not write about it. So, fine. And, after our meeting, we hung out the rest of the day and we talked about all the issues, decommissioning, shared future, integrated education. I mean, all the big sticking points in the peace process, we talked about them all, and we were coming up with, I thought, reasonable solutions to it all. But the unionist guy was terrified that I would write about this, and he must have asked me about 10 times in the day, please don't write about this. And we were sitting in the airport lounge having a pint, getting on the plane, and at this stage he was practically crying. Look, you would really make life really, really tough for me if you wrote about this. And I said to him, look, I promise you I won't write about it. I actually did write about it, by the way, but that was like, it was about a year later, and I didn't name him, or I disguised where it was and stuff like this, but I thought the point was worth making. So he says, look, I'm not going to write about it, but can I say something to you that, what I have seen today by you two hanging out together, the fact that you're Sinn Féin and the DUP, you've given me hope, because if you guys can sit as two former enemies and can talk about these issues and can come up with solutions that I think could work, if you could sell them to your people and get the support, it's been inspiring. I mean, I'm coming away today thinking, that our process is not over. In fact, if anything, you've given me a lot of hope today just because of, so I want to thank you for that. But I also want to challenge you, because whilst this remains a private conversation between the two of you at a campsite in England, away from Northern Ireland, and when you go back home, you sit in, opposite rooms and you don't talk to one another and you don't come on TV and speak together and stuff like this. What you do is you give people in my community permission not to engage the other also, because they take their lead from you. So if our society is going to change, you guys are going to have to really step up to the plate in terms of, leading by example. I'm glad to say that in some respects, some of them have done that, and that we have. I mean, we went on then, and you had Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, I think, sharing power very successfully together for a number of years. I think things have slipped a wee bit in recent times, and there's been all sorts of reasons why that's the case. But the challenge is still there for people, in Northern Ireland, that really we have to really make this process work. And we have to, at some time in our future, stand up on our own 2 feet and make it work together, because what happens at the moment is anytime there's any sign of a crisis, we have, Big Daddy coming in from England or from the Irish government or from the American government to hold our hands and get us through another crisis. And that's not politics. Our politicians really need to stand up now and really lead by example. And I'm hoping that in generations to come that people will see that Northern Ireland, it is that place in the DVD, but it's not just that place in the DVD for people that live in the leafy suburbs, but that, young people in Ardoyne and Shankle Road, in the small places that Eleanor Roosevelt talks about, are also feeling that as well. Northern Ireland can't afford to carry on the way it's going. It can't afford to have, 2 schools in a small village that maybe only has about 600 people because we have to have a Catholic school and a state school for the Protestants. We can't afford to have 2 leisure centres, a leisure centre in a Protestant part of town, a leisure centre in a Catholic part of town. We can't afford to have 2 libraries, a library in a Catholic part of town, a library in a Protestant part of town. We can't afford the politics that we have in terms of the cost of division. I think it was Deloitte, one of those big global, companies that do research on behalf of governments, calculated the annual cost of division in Northern Ireland is something like £1.5 billion. Now, we're living in an age where welfare is under threat, where austerity is pretty much the order of the day, where hard-working families are being pressed more than they've ever been pressed before. And at the same time, our divided society squanders £1.5 billion on supporting a segregated society, and I don't think it can survive, and I hope that it doesn't.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.